So I'm going to start today with a reading from Meg Barnhouse, who is one of our more famous ministers. She's presently the minister of our large congregation in Austin, First UU Austin. And unfortunately, she's announced her retirement in a few months, but she has a way with words. She says, "One of my friends from Alabama has a shrine in the hallway of his house. Over a little shelf with candles on it hangs a picture of Jesus. On one side of Jesus hangs another picture, one of President Jimmy Carter. On the other side is University of Alabama football coach Bear Bryant." One of the sources of our UU faith is the prophetic words and deeds of great people. And believing that there is ongoing revelation about the truth of things, one lets go of thinking that all truth has been laid out for us, that a sacred book could have the answers to everything. Truth is revealed through actions and words, not only of ancient people, but people who have made history in our own lifetimes. We also learn from the words and deeds of the people down the street in our neighborhood, sitting next to us on the subway, dancing to the swing band while we play the fiddle. I have been thinking for years about whose pictures might make up my shrine, if I were to build one. I might have pictures of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Robin Hood, Margaret Sanger, Bette Midler. I wasn't raised to have heroes in the sense of believing someone was without flaws. My father taught me that the line between creation and destruction runs down the middle of every person. He adored JFK, and maybe he thought of him as a hero, but he was well aware of at least a few of the man's weaknesses. This sense that everyone is flawed has kept me from building a shrine like my friends. It's getting harder and harder to admire people with your whole heart. We come to realize unsavory things about Thomas Jefferson or Jimmy Carter. Someone says Bette Midler wasn't kind to the little people on her way up to the top. Bear Bryant certainly wasn't a perfect hero, and apparently Gandhi had difficult relationships with his children. Should we allow ourselves to enshrine people who do a variety of deeds, some enlightened and some egregious? Perhaps we could keep our sense of purity if we allow as much of their picture in our shrine as represents the percentage of them that is admirable. So we would have torn up confetti photographs in a montage. I would hate to think how I might have to rip off chunks of my own photograph if I wanted to be up there amongst my heroes. If I demand perfection of them, surely I must demand it of myself, right? So I'm stuck. I want to draw from words and deeds of great people, but how do you tell who is great and who isn't? What if I love some of the things Emerson said and I didn't love the others? What if one of my friends is brave and kind, adventuresome, healthy, and skilled, but clumsy at relationships and bad with money? I still admire my friend. The ancient Greek heroes all had flaws, and their God had flaws. The characters moving through the Hebrew scriptures had flaws, yet they're held up to us as models of faithfulness and bravery. Where did I get this idea that people in my shrine should be perfect? Where did I get the idea that perfection had anything to do with greatness? The revelation of truth in my life has come from things people have written and said, from a painting by Mark Rothko, and from music by Josquin des Prez. I just got a swift and lovely, beyond categorical thinking lesson from a burly Alaskan man in his 70s. His hair was white and somewhat uncombed. His boots were scuffed and his khakis wrinkled. He was getting a pedicure in the Fairbanks nail salon where I was doing the same. That took me aback a little, but it was when I saw him hand the lady a bottle of autumn bronze polish that I had to admit that I looked at him and judged him as a certain type of man. He showed me handily that I had no idea what type of man he was, and for that I thank him. His picture would be in my shrine for a while at least. Suddenly, it has occurred to me that those I enshrine don't have to be the same people year in and year out. Guides need to change as the path changes. I might need a model of insane courage at one point in my life, while at another point I may not be taking the same risks I would were I responsible only for myself. At that point, I may want a model of care and gentle thoroughness. I can relax. Perfection and greatness, I think, are unrelated. I can now respond with equanimity to the people who love to burst my bubble about people I admire by telling me Gandhi's children hated him, or that Bette Midler was rude to them, or that Robin Hood is fictional. I'll just mutter, "Your mom's fictional," under my breath, and light my candles in peace. Love me some Meg Barnhouse. So if you haven't already guessed or read the front of the order of service, today's topic is the second source of Unitarian Universalism. And again, our sources, really I call them our huge buffet of knowledge and wisdom and inspiration from which we as Unitarian Universalists are encouraged to draw from on our personal faith journeys. And I really can't say enough how special this is, the acknowledgement that truth can come from many places. It's kind of like in school when we had to use more than one source for a research paper to avoid presenting too narrow a viewpoint, right? If one source doesn't work for research papers, why should our religious view or worldview be limited to a single or limited set of sources? Our list of sources, our UU bibliography, I might call it, is incredibly expansive. And I think it's really important that we do not take that for granted. So our second source of Unitarian Universalism, as it reads, is words and deeds of prophetic people which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. All right, that's a lot to unpack, a lot of important keywords there. But let's just zero in on prophetic people. Like Meg said, how do we know who's a prophet and who's not? Who are they? What is a prophet like for a Unitarian Universalist? And what does it mean for us, for someone to be a prophet? So I'll share with you a few quick definitions of a prophet. Some, more than others, might work for us. A prophet is one who utters divinely inspired revelations, such as the writer of one of the prophetic books of the Bible. Or a prophet can be one regarded by a group of followers as the final authoritative revealer of God's will. This kind of prophet would be a Muhammad. Or a prophet can be one gifted with more than ordinary spiritual and moral insight. Or a prophet could be one who foretells future events, a predictor. And finally, a prophet could be called an effective or leading spokesperson for a cause, a doctrine, or a group. So that's a pretty broad spectrum of definitions, from the person who can predict the future to a spokesperson, right? That's like a lot. So if we sort through these varying definitions of prophet, there are a couple that I think are maybe more generally relevant to our thinking or to be useful to us. I like the one who is gifted with more than ordinary spiritual and moral insight. All you have to do to be that is be more than ordinary in those categories. Okay, that's not like the bar is not that high. But for the ones who did, also under this same category, though, the bar is really high if you think about, people with more than ordinary spiritual and moral insight as being our Dr. King and Gandhi and Mother Teresa and the Dalai Lama. All of those people whose work puts them kind of at this intersection of spirituality and morality and justice. So the other definition I think we can work with, although it's a little bit more on the wimpy side, is the prophet as an effective or leading spokesperson for a cause, doctrine, or a group. Now, it's technically accurate in many ways, but it's not a very inspiring definition, but you could call Gandhi or Dr. King a spokesperson for a very important cause. That sounds like an understatement, though. But then again, it's kind of accurate, because the word spokesperson means a person who speaks up, and that is a really important quality of being prophetic or being a prophet. So if we go back to the wording of our second source, the source itself tells us what a prophet is and potentially how to recognize one if you bump into one on the street. The source says what these prophetic people do. They are the people who tell us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. So virtually any voice that tells us that, tells us to confront the bad stuff, the bad things in this world with justice and compassion and love, that can be considered a prophetic voice. And I'd say one probably worth listening to. And yet, as Meg Barnhouse emphasized, we all have the power to be prophetic. We all have the power to speak up for what is right. So I guess by now you've realized that being famous or world-renowned is not required to be a prophet. And prophets, as Meg says, are not required to be perfect or treated as if they were perfect. This is not about idol worship, right? And that's why I think our source tells us to pay heed to the words and deeds of the prophetic people, their words and deeds, rather than the people themselves, right? We don't idolize the person, we appreciate their words and their deeds. Because we're not worshiping these people, right? We're taking on the challenge that they have laid out before us, that they have spoken up about, and using their actions to actually guide us. So, it's their call we should heed to confront powers and structures of evil with all of these, justice and compassion, and again, in love. They make the call, and we're compelled to answer it. And as a minister, I'm required to use my own prophetic voice. So I show up and I demonstrate. I go to meetings with legislators, which is really no fun at all. And I show up to public witness events in this really unattractive clerical collar that I hate to wear. But the point of that is to remind some big decision makers that God is watching them. Even though that's not necessarily my own theology, it is theirs, so I am going to hold them accountable to it. Why not use it to my best advantage? And sometimes I have to say hard things that people don't always want to hear, like pointing out privilege or implicit bias within the congregation and outside the congregation. Standing up for the marginalized, running to the margins at the expense of those who might think they deserve my attention more. Putting the congregation's needs ahead of those of individuals. It's not easy, it's uncomfortable. People don't always respond the way you want them to. And keeping up the love and the compassion when confronted with ugliness and evil, that's really hard. It's some advanced spiritual exercise right there. It's really hard to be prophetic and deal with what might come back at you and fall into that trap of ridicule and demonization and sarcasm, all of those things that this second source calls us to rise above. And of course, like a lot of our sources and principles, they're very challenging to live by. Some people accuse our religion of being watered down and it asks nothing of us, this kind of nothing, wimpy religion. But yet, our source says we must confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. That is a pretty big ask, so don't let anyone get away with telling you that you use our loosey-goosey and don't really believe in anything hard. And if we're going to confront evil and injustice, it matters how we do it, how we go about it. Are we really modeling compassion and the transforming power of love in our fight for justice? Or are we just throwing more fuel on the fire of disagreement and incivility and hate? This is really something we need to think about in our increasingly divisive world when everyone is ready with a gasoline can and a match, right? On a much happier note, when I think of a young living prophet, one that comes to mind for me is Malala, the young Muslim woman who became an activist for girls' education. And as a result, she suffered retaliation from the Taliban. UUism has its own prophets too. There's a book out there called Sources of Our Faith, Inspirational Readings. The Reverend Kathleen Rollens, she wrote something on the second source that I really like. Here's what she has to say about the prophets. In a religion of deeds, not creeds, We look to the example of our spiritual ancestors and the prophets of our time for the strength and wisdom to do the right thing. Most religious traditions have their founders, their prophets, and their sages. UUism is no different. We revere people like Francis David, the first clergy person in the Reformation to proclaim religious tolerance. We hold up Theodore Parker, the radical abolitionist minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a leader of the Transcendental Movement, Susan B. Anthony, who fought for women's suffrage, the Reverend Norbert Chopik, who defied the Nazis and lost his life for it, the Reverend James Reeb, martyred in Selma, Alabama, in the cause for civil rights, and many more. But we don't really lift up our luminaries above all others. This is her continuing, saying only with them truth will be found. We are led to deeper wisdom and action by many outside our own faith story who have spoken to the human condition and the ethical demand to leave the world better than we found it. Those whom we call prophets include courageous leaders of direct social action, but also those who call for an inner revolution that must precede any transformation in the wider world. So there's this idea of the prophet that tends to the outward and to the inward. Kathleen goes on, many theologians have reflected on the inseparability of justice, compassion, and love in our engagement with the world. Justice without compassion can lead to legalism and brutality. Loving without a commitment to justice can become mere sentimentality. The powers and structures of evil surround us. Many religious doctrines try to define and explain them. But we have turned away from theological disputes about evil, focusing instead on faithful encouragement to stand up and confront it. So that's the end of Kathleen's long quote. Me talking again. So all this brings up another aspect of our second source. It gives us a tactic for confronting evil. And again, as she alluded to, we don't have the most definite answers about evil. We don't take seriously the idea people are born evil and that, they have this innate need to be saved. We don't really believe there's a devil on our shoulder all the time trying to steer us in the wrong direction. But instead, what we focus on is just confronting the evil that does exist, evil deeds and evil systems, which I think is a refreshingly practical approach to dealing with evil. I also appreciate that Kathleen Rollins pointed out that prophets not only encourage us to change the world, they can also encourage us to change ourselves. She called them the prophets who call for an inner revolution. So I can expand my prophet list to include the Buddha, Thich Nhat Hanh, and the ancient yogis. And some prophets did both, the inner stuff and the outer stuff, calling for both internal spiritual transformation and also external societal transformation. You might have heard of this guy called Jesus of Nazareth. He was a prophet because he was a few different things, right? He was a social justice activist. He called out all kinds of hypocrisy and inequality and cruelty practiced by the Roman oppressors, cruelty practiced by the legalistic Judaism of the time. But at the same time, he was calling out everything that was wrong in society. He was calling ordinary people to take a good look at themselves, right? And what's really interesting about the importance of being a prophet in the biblical tradition is that in the New Testament, it goes to great lengths and a lot of words to establish that Jesus of Nazareth was actually a direct descendant of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. Biblical trivia, you don't get that very often from me. All right, so one of the most important things I believe about our second source is that it reminds us of the people who came before us. People we can learn from and gain inspiration from. Second source reminds us to confront evil, not talk about it or complain about it, but speak up and do something about it. And finally, the second principle reminds us how to go about this confrontation so we don't end up just contributing more evil, throwing more evil on the pile, and making things worse. For there to be true justice, our justice making has to be rooted in compassion and the transformational power of love. Otherwise, we're just a bunch of angry people yelling about stuff. And our world already has too many angry people yelling about stuff. So today, I invite you to keep close at heart and mind your prophets. Spend time to think about who your prophets are, whoever they might be, and in living or dead or fictional, and invite them along with you on your life's journey. Remember their words and deeds and allow them to encourage your own prophetic voice. And I'm just going to say that Unitarian Universalism, this faith tradition that is so small yet so special, is important and it's liberating. And please, do not let it go to waste. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.